Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you everyone for your patience. I joked earlier, I said if I had any issues, it was going to be in the area of conflict. And it seems like I'm always in conflict with my computer. So let's get started. You know, it's very interesting. When Magdalena first asked me if I could speak, she wanted to know if I could speak about conflict. And I said, well, of course. And here's the irony. April is Workplace Conflict Awareness Month. And even though we deal with conflict all year long, I thought this is an appropriate topic to have in the conference this year. So let's talk about what we're going to cover first of all, and then we can get right into it. So we're going to look at things like what's the problem? How do we define what the problem is? Important piece of who owns a problem when we're in conflict, and then some tips on how do you go about solving that problem. Okay, so let's take a look as we start at some of the underlying causes of conflict, and these causes are really universal causes. Then we're going to look at some process that you can take for actually uncovering the issue, some best practices. And then finally, some guidance on how do I go about addressing the issue once I've discovered what it is. Now, I talk a lot about problems because I look at conflict as just being problem solving. So I'll interchangeably use terms like problem and issue, but I'm really getting back to talking about what are some of the ways that we deal with conflict and assure that we're dealing with the correct issue. So let's look at some of these underlying causes, and I'm sure none of them are going to be really surprising to anyone. We all know that change can really create a lot of havoc. We've all gone through a lot of change this year, and I'm sure that there's been a lot of conflict that's arisen, not things that you didn't experience in the past, but certainly we saw a lot of opportunity to have conflict during 2020. And then expectations. It's so difficult if people don't know what's expected of them. That can just create a lot of confusion among folks. And that confusion often leads to conflict. And we're going to look at each one of these in a little bit more detail. We work a lot in teams in today's workplace environment, and teams are comprised of people. And so when you bring people together, they have their own opinions and their own ways of doing things. So that's going to create conflict in an organization. And then that brings us to one of the last ones, which is diversity and differences. Because when we're in a conflict situation, not so much when we're in a conflict situation, but when we look at all the people that we deal with, people bring their whole selves to work. And it's more than just those dynamics of diversity like race and gender and ethnicity. People have different opinions, people have different backgrounds and skill sets. So if you combine all of that together, you kind of go, gee, no wonder that there's conflict in the workplace because we're dealing with a lot of different people. Let's look at change a little bit. And, you know, I talk about change because there are so many different aspects of it. And we've seen a lot of it this year. But some of the more traditional things that go on in an organization is when there's a new leader, whether it's at the top of the organization or whether it's somebody who's new to the department, who's taking over as a team leader. People get used to whoever was in the leadership position before. Now there's anxiety. They've got to get used to somebody new. What is that person going to expect of us? And it's just normal. And as much as a leader may try to address some of these issues, what ultimately ends up happening is people just need time. They need to adjust. You know, it isn't something that's going to happen immediately, even if they're the greatest leader in the world, even if they do everything they can to instill confidence in the workforce. Then there's organizational change. And, you know, if I had the whole screen available, I'd ask for a show of hands, but I know everybody's hand would be up. Who hasn't experienced some level of organizational change? You know, sometimes that's something very simple as moving offices, moving to a new location. Sometimes it's implementing a new policy or practice within the organization. Sometimes it's a reorganization. People and functions are now reporting to different places. You know, projects get changed around and suddenly things are different. People have to get used to doing things differently. And, you know, we all know we get comfortable in the way that we do things, and suddenly change happens. Suddenly we have to do things differently. Technology changes. I mean, that goes without saying. We've all been getting used to new technologies this year. We've all had the opportunities to have glitches in technology, as we just saw that I had. But it takes time. People need to get comfortable with working with new technology. In fact, I was talking to a gentleman yesterday, and he said, "Oh, I'm thinking about getting a Mac," and he was asking me what kind of computer I had, and he said, "Oh, it's probably a lot that I'm going to have to get used to doing." And I said, "You know, it really isn't. Just get in there and do it, and before you know it, it's just going to be second nature to you." So we've seen how the effects of technology can have a positive impact. You know, look at how we can have this conference today. There's another group that I'm part of, and they had to go to total Zoom meetings, and what they realized is we can expand our reach, and we don't have to just be focused on the immediate geographic area. Then there are economic conditions and change, and we've seen dramatic changes in the economy, things that we just could not have predicted before the pandemic. But even in somewhat normal times, there are swings, there's upsurges and downturns in the economy, and that affects sometimes an entire industry. It affects organizations, and people get nervous. People get, they were content, and now they're feeling like, gee, am I going to lose my job? Or am I going to have to take on more responsibilities? If things are on the upswing, am I ready for some of those new responsibilities? So all of this creates anxiety. And I think the one thing that we can do as HR professionals is to remind our management team that everybody sees change in a different way. And when we look at all the changes that we've been through this past year, we have to pay a lot of attention to that if we want to keep some of the negative impact of those changes down, and if we want to avoid conflict in the organization. The next is expectations, and I want to take a minute to talk about this. There is nothing worse for an individual to not know what is expected of him or her when they take on a new role. And it is so critical that expectations are explained at the very beginning of the employment process. It starts with the interview, letting people know this is what the role is that we're looking at you for, that you have some interest in, and this is what success is going to look like in that role. And that's something that has to be enforced over and over again. When employment starting on that first day of employment, that's the time to set those expectations out and to let people know that this is what success looks like. This is what's expected in terms of behavior, in terms of output for the role that you're in. And you have to require accountability, and the two really kind of go hand in hand with each other. If people don't know what's expected of them, they can't be accountable because they just don't know. They have to be responsible, but being responsible for what? Again, if it hasn't been explained to them. So people really need to know the standards and the guidelines for the position that they're in. And they also have to know what behaviors are required within your organization. And without that, they can't be held accountable for anything, and if they're really kind of operating in the dark, mistakes are going to happen. And those mistakes can lead to conflict. And that's when people have to, kind of step forward and say, wait a minute, was I clear? Did everybody know really what the ground rules were and what was expected of them? Then teams. Most important with teams is that trust has to be established. And trust has to be established at the very, very beginning, because without trust, the teams are just going to crumble, and they're not going to be effective at all. And you know, we all know that you've got that old adage of forming, norming, and storming. Well, during that norming stage, this is when goals and guidelines have to be established, and that has to be something that the team all agrees on. You know, so things like, how are we going to make decisions as a team? How are we going to address assignments? You know, is there going to be a leader? Is there going to be people that are overseeing seeing certain portions of an assignment or of a project that we're working on? How is information going to flow among team members? You know, what's the standard going to be for that? If adjustments need to be made, if changes need to be made to what we're doing, how are we going to deal with some of those changes? And then making sure everybody understands their role and the responsibilities that go along with their role. If this isn't clearly defined, people start stepping all over each other, because again, it gets back to expectations. Nobody knows what's expected of them. And they start looking to other people and going, oh, well, I thought you did this. Oh, I thought you did that. And that's really going to diminish the impact of the team. So making sure that people are all on board and they know where their role begins and ends, where their responsibilities begins and end, is really going to reduce any infighting that may occur as the team is getting formed and as the team is going forward and doing the work that they're entrusted to do by the organization. And then finally, develop some team norms. And by that, I mean things like those guidelines, those guiding principles that everybody is going to adhere to. Everybody's going to be an active participant. You know, there's no exception to that. We're going to respect everybody's viewpoint. And in fact, we're going to cultivate a variety of options as we look at how we're going to get our work accomplished. And then we're going to have a commitment, a mutual commitment to meeting our deadlines, and understand what happens if something interferes with our ability to meet those deadlines. So if teams can work along these lines, they should be able to keep a lot of the conflict at bay. But if there aren't guidelines and clear roles and clear team norms, it's really going to be a prescription for seeing a lot more conflict among the team members. And then one of my very favorite topics is diversity and differences. And, you know, this goes well beyond our individual diversity, like race and gender and ethnicity. When we look at the diversity in today's workplaces, we've got multi-generations working in the workplace. We've got a lot of workplaces that are multicultural. And you see that really in a lot of geographic areas across the country. People come to work and they bring their whole selves, and that means they have different skills, different experiences, different styles in how they communicate, styles in how they work, styles in how they make decisions and solve problems. People have different educations and educational backgrounds, and they have different work experiences as well. You know, also add to that, you work with people who are from different disciplines. So, you know, finance has to get along with accounting, has to get along with marketing, has to get along with engineering. We also see much more of a geographically mobile population. People don't necessarily grow up in one place and stay there. People move around a lot in today's organizations. And I think we're going to see a new dynamic with that as we start to look at what our post-COVID world is going to look like. Because not only are you going to see people saying, well, you know what, I want to get out of a high dollar geographic area. I want to move back to, to home, or I want to go off and move to a place where the cost of living is a lot lower because, hey, I can work from home now. And that also is going to create, these hybrid workplaces and hybrid workforces that I'm sure all of you have been reading about. What happens when some people don't want to come back to work, when half the people are home half of the time, half the people are home all of the time, and everybody else is in the office. So how do we assure that everybody's needs are being met? And looking at this, you kind of go, gee, no wonder it's so complex. No wonder we have a prescription for having conflict just when we look at the nature of the workforce and the nature of change that we've been seeing in the past 12, 13 months. Okay, I'm going to move into the next section that really talks about how do you identify the problem? Because if you don't understand what the problem is, you can't treat it. Just like a doctor needs a diagnosis in order to treat an illness. So you want to be able to get to the real problem. So you've got to get information, and very rarely do you have that information at the very beginning. To get that information, you want to make sure people are engaging in dialogue. They've got to be talking to each other. You've got to identify what that real issue is versus the perceived problem. And I was once doing a session with my co-author, and we were talking about conflict, and there were a couple of people on the panel. And this one woman kept insisting that it was the perceived problem that was really the issue. And everybody's going, no, 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 no. One person may have a perception, but everybody else sees that there's a much different issue in play there. And then finally, and most importantly, and I could do a whole session on listening, you've got to be able to listen. All the parties that are involved in the conflict have to be listening to each other. And that's something that we don't do that well. We don't practice listening. We don't learn how to listen necessarily. So many times people think that listening is hearing what the other person is saying, but formulating what their response is going to be. And that is not what listening is at all. That's really not part of the communication process. So let's start looking at how we uncover the issue. If you are explaining a problem to someone, or if you're facilitating a discussion, and we'll talk a little bit more about facilitation in just a few minutes, you want to make sure that the information you're giving is very specific, very succinct, and very objective. You want to be clear. And one of the ways that you do that is you can give examples. So for one thing that often happens is people may be in conflict, especially in a team, because they're dependent on other people to get different parts of the assignment done. If Joe is always late getting information to Mary, they're going to start to get into a conflict situation. So Mary needs to explain, every time I have a delay getting information from you, it's holding up my ability to finish this part of the project to move it along to Steve. So the more precise, the more details you can give that are factual is going to help get to the root cause of the problem. If you are on the other end and you're trying to get information, you want to be curious and you want to probe. You want to get as many details as you can. And to do that, you've got to ask a lot of open-ended questions. You've got to ask those who, what, when, where, why questions, and you've got to get clarity. If you don't understand what the person is saying, you've got to go back and ask some of those clarifying questions. Help me to understand. Can you verify what you mean by? So you're getting as much detail as possible, because what you don't want to do again is be in that position where I'm making assumptions where I think this is what the other person said, so I'm just going to take that and run with it. Well, you may be misunderstanding what the other person said. You also want to avoid speculation as you're in this phase of gathering as much information as possible. And by that we mean, don't make assumptions. Don't try to understand what somebody else's motive is. And too often that shows up in a conflict situation where somebody's like, I wonder what she's after. I wonder why she gave me this. I wonder why she wants me to do this. You know, what's the underlying motive that individual has? You want to get away from some of these assumptions. I mean, you even want to get away from the assumption that somebody has an underlying motive, in fact, and just stick to the facts. This is really a fact-finding mission that you're on at this early stage of uncovering the issue. And then finally, you want to go back and ask for clarity. You know, if people are using a lot of jargon, ask them to explain what that jargon is, or acronyms that you may not be familiar with. And, you know, that happens a lot even within an organization. But if you're talking to people from a different function, you know, we'll throw out terms in HR like EAP, and somebody else is going, huh, what are you talking about? And you know, you've got to be a little bit more specific about that. Also, don't be afraid to ask somebody, or again, if you're facilitating the discussion, what I heard you say, or what I think you said is this. Is that correct? Can you clarify that for me? Because again, I don't want to assume that what I'm hearing is actually factual. Then you want to make sure that you're addressing the problem by not letting personalities get in the way. And that's what we mean by focus on the problem and not the people. Sometimes it's very easy to take something personal if somebody has a differing point of view than you. And when you kind of get into that mode, then it's really easy for everything to start to crumble down. Don't worry so much about the person. Don't worry so much about the other individual's personality. Yes, some people may be a little bit more abrasive than you are, but that's not necessarily what the problem is going to be. And unless you have somebody whose behavior has been so poor, but that's a whole different issue, and that's probably something that you need to elevate to management. So you really want to hone in at this point on what the issues are. You want to focus on interests and not positions. And what I mean by that is that the position is the stand that you take in a conflict. It's kind of where you draw your line in the sand and say, this is what I'm demanding. This is what has to happen. On the other hand, an interest is really something mutual. And it looks at what's going to be in the best for both parties, or all the parties that are involved in the conflict, or what's in the best interest of the organization. So it's really, it's a much broader collaborative type of an approach. And if you stay focused on positions, you know, once again, the real problem isn't really going to come out. You're not going to be able to uncover what's happening. And if you can't uncover what's happening, you're not going to get to the point where you can actually come up with some solutions for that particular problem. And then finally, everybody who is part of the conflict, part of the problem, has to accept their own responsibility for it. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but it is so important that people take ownership and say, this is what I see. That's obviously not what you see. What can we do together to try to come to a mutual understanding and come up with a mutual solution? Because that's the ultimate goal. So a few things to be aware of is, first of all, don't play the blame game, as I like to say. It's not really a matter of who's right and who's wrong. That is not going to be productive. That's just going to drag everything right back down. You don't want to identify victims and villains. You don't want to be looking at people and saying, you know, gee, it's kind of your fault. I would never do anything like that. And you're always doing things like that. And no wonder we're having all of these problems in the organization. Doesn't help. And then finally, you want to keep all those trivial issues, the helpless stories, all the background noise out of it, because they're generally not going to be relevant to what the main issue is. And sometimes you've just got to shut things down, whether you're in it, you're in the conflict directly with somebody else, or if you're facilitating it. I was once doing a session between these two gentlemen, and the one guy, there were things he was just not going to let go, and things that were just not relevant to what we were trying to accomplish. And I finally had to step up and say to him, kind of forcefully, Eric, enough. This is not relevant. You'd already brought that up before. I told you we're not going to discuss that. We're going to discuss A, B, and C. Don't bring in X and Y. Just they're off the table for right now. And I mean, he was not happy, but this was kind of his approach. The more stuff I can throw at the other guy, the better off this is going to be. Did not move things along very well. In fact, we had to stop the session and move it to the next day. Okay, one of my favorite areas, and I'm not necessarily talking about Socorro, but I did love it down there the time I had a chance to visit. But one of my favorite areas in conflict is understanding who owns the problem. And one of the tenets of good problem solving, of conflict resolution, is to challenge your assumptions. And one of the assumptions that we always make is, who owns the conflict? And hint is, HR doesn't own it, the manager doesn't own it. Ownership is not necessarily a top-down process. So let's talk about problem ownership. Got to bring people to the point where they gain agreement on what the problem is, and hopefully you've gone through that with identifying the issues, but they've also got to gain agreement on who's responsible, and they have to accept some responsibility. We're going to talk a little bit about the dangers of intervening, because that's kind of natural. It's something we like to do in HR because we want to be helpful. We're going to talk about some of the basics of mediation, and the role a mediator plays, and how you can take some of the skills of a mediator and use that as you're helping other people to solve their problem. And then you also have to know when it's appropriate to intervene in a situation. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So when we talk about gaining responsibility, golden rule of conflict resolution, the individuals who are involved in the conflict have to realize their role. They have to accept that they have a vested interest in solving the problem. And they also have to understand that they're responsible for solving the problem, that it's not somebody else's problem to solve. The time we've spent earlier when we were talking about how do we identify the problem can also help to uncover who exactly is a party to this conflict. So it serves a dual benefit for the organization. The benefits of having people deal with the problem rather than ignore it are huge. Many times you go in trying to fix one problem, but then the solutions that you come up with, you realize, hey, they're going to benefit in other areas. You may come up with a more creative way of doing something that's not just going to address the immediate problem that's in front of you, but it's going to benefit ways that, other things that the organization is doing. So it's important that you keep as many of those options open. The right solution often generates a lot of creativity and innovation in the organization. And it's something that me and my co-author are very, very passionate about. We think about conflict and we think about it as always being negative, but there is good conflict that's out there. And we'll talk about that at the end. But if you think about conflict coming up with new ways of doing things and opening some doors, it can really be, very, very powerful if it's managed appropriately. And that's why we take some time to look at conflict management and conflict resolution skills. Part of gaining responsibility is that all parties really need to realize that they have to be part of the solution, not just a part of the problem. And what I always find interesting is when you empower people to be part of the solution, they suddenly get a lot more interested in wanting to solve something rather than just hide the problem away someplace. This is a team effort, though, which is why it's so important that everybody gains, acknowledges their responsibility for it. Everybody has a part to play. And yes, HR and sometimes a manager has a part to play, but they're not intrinsically involved in looking at what that solution is going to be, unless, of course, it's something, whatever's going on is something that's really rather dire in the organization. If we're dealing with some really poor behavior or really poor performance. Why is it not a good idea to intervene? Why is it so important to understand who's got the responsibility, who's a part of the problem solving process, and what happens if you do just jump in and intervene? Like this woman I was telling you about from this other session that Barbara and I had done a couple of years ago. She not only thought that that it was the perceived problem that was the issue. She really had this thought that it was her responsibility as HR to go in and solve all of these problems. And it was really funny because Barbara and I was sort of sitting there trying to not say anything because we're in a panel discussion. And somebody in the audience put up their hand and said, wait a minute, whenever I'm in a conflict situation, I want the two people who are the cause of the conflict talking about it. It's, she basically said, it's not my problem to solve. And one of my favorite lines from somebody I used to work with, she always used to say, I'm not in it. So what happens if you solve the problem for them? Well, it's going to hinder everything. It's going to reduce the collaboration among the staff members. They're going to get lazy. They're just going to say, hey, let's just take it to HR, let them deal with it. And they're not going to have any sense of accountability. And it's going to make them more and more dependent on their managers and on HR. And it's going to diminish trust, not just trust among the parties, but they're not going to have a lot of trust in other people in the organization, especially if you come back and tell them, well, this is what you have to do, and they don't like it. So they really have to be the ones solving the problem. You have to take the appropriate role. So always ask yourself, if you're starting to feel like you're getting pulled into something, who owns the problem and what's my role as an HR person? Two common forms of dispute resolution or arbitration and mediation. And I'm just going to talk about them both briefly, but then talk a little bit about how the role of a mediator can come into play and some of the skills that you can develop. So in arbitration, it's pretty much like a judge and juror or a trial situation. The case is presented to an arbitrator, and it's the arbitrator listens to both sides, and the arbitrator comes up with a decision. So they impose that decision on both parties, and that decision is binding. So if you don't like it, well, you've got to live with it. It's pretty much a cut and dry process. Mediation is a lot different, however. It's really a facilitated discussion between the two parties. And it's the parties who determine what the solution is, and they have to agree on it. And yes, there's often a formal process around that. But the bottom line is the mediator has no decision-making authority. If the people can't if the two parties in a disagreement can't come to an agreement on what the solution is, the mediator's hands are tied. They can't say, well, gee, I think you should do this, or I think you should do that. No decision-making authority there. But there are some things we can learn from mediation in terms of the skills that a mediator has to have, Because if this is nothing more than in the workplace, a facilitated discussion, understanding how a mediation will work will help you to be able to go in and perhaps facilitate this discussion and kind of be in that quasi mediation role. So we're going to talk about the basics of mediation. We are also going to talk about the role that the mediator plays, and it really is that facilitation role to help the people find what's often referred to as the third story. I'm sure you've heard the old adage, there's his side, there's her side, there's his story, there's her story, but somewhere in the middle is the truth, is the real story. So in the process of mediation, the goal is to get the people involved in the conflict, listening to the other person's story, listening to the other person's point of view, having an open mind around this, and being in that position where they can see what the third story is. You also want people to be able to understand each other, and they don't have to agree with each other, but they need to understand where the other person is coming from. And mediation is all about good communication skills. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're going to be facilitating or mediating a situation, you want to be able to model what some of those good facilitation skills are. So how does it usually work, and what does a mediator normally do? And one of the objectives is to help both parties define what the business problem is. I said earlier, don't make it about individuals and their personalities. This is about recognizing that there is a problem. The problem is likely impacting the organization. So you've got to help them to define what that problem is. A mediator is going to schedule the meeting, recommended that it be scheduled in a neutral location at a convenient time. In normal times, if everybody was back in the office, usually you want to try to find a conference room that has a certain degree of privacy. Might be a little bit more difficult if you're trying to do it on some kind of a video platform, but it still can be done. But you just want to make sure that the setting is appropriate and that people have the time dedicated to be able to have this meeting. You want to determine roles, and that primarily, that's really to communicate to the other people what your role is as a mediator. You want to make it clear you're not the one that's going to be driving the conversation. You're just going to be monitoring it and keeping it on track. You are not going to be asking questions unless you see a need to jump in and clarify something. Gee, Joe looks a little confused. Mary, would you mind repeating what you just said and explain it a little bit better? So that's the only time you're going to interject in the discussion. And then you want to set guidelines for the participants. And they should be things like everybody has to participate. One person can't sit back with their arms folded and refuse to say anything. Everybody has to present what their interests are. Everybody gets to ask questions and should ask questions of the other person or people. And everybody has to provide solutions, because again, this is a team effort. And if everybody's not engaged, then it's not going to happen. One of the other things that you may do as a facilitator is take notes. And we generally recommend that, so you're capturing everything, some of the salient points that have been made. You're getting down some of the specific facts that people may have raised. And you just want to let people know that that's the reason you're doing it, and that you will review your notes with them at the end of the session. This way, nobody's feeling like, oh, gee, what is she writing down over there? what did I just say that's going to make somebody upset or something else? So be very clear around the guidelines and how the whole meeting is going to take place. There's, okay. We talked about intervention and how it's something that generally should be avoided. But there are times, as we all know in HR, when HR or management has to get involved in a situation. If an employee is dealing with some kind of a personal problem, this is when making a referral to an employee assistance program is probably the most effective thing that you can do. If somebody is exhibiting very disruptive workplace behavior, or they're having performance issues, then you want to turn to your policies and you want to deal with it, in accordance to your policies, your practices, the protocols that you have in place. That takes it outside of the conflict realm and puts it squarely back into what is the manager's responsibility for managing his or her own team members. If there's severe behavior like bullying that may take a different tactic, that may also be something where you refer somebody to an employee assistance program, for example. But not necessarily, if it's really severe behavior, that may not be the appropriate time to sit down and say, let's have a conversation about this, let's talk. Sometimes the solution has to be directed. And then, of course, if it's harassment, we all know that there are certain steps that we have to take as employers. We have to go about an investigation because there are certain things that the EEOC has said, this is what you will do when these situations arise. So these are some of the exceptions to, hey, don't get involved. You don't own the problem. You still don't own the problem here, but there's some very prescribed avenues for you to take when you're encountering something like this. So as we get to this point, we've identified a problem, we've brought people together, we've identified who owns the problem. A couple of things to keep in mind at this stage is, what are the things that you can do to ensure that you're going to have a successful ending to this? Well, part of the thing that a manager and HR can do is to coach the employees, to give them that support to solve their own problems. Communicate some of the organization's expectations about how people should be resolving some of their own conflicts and solving some of their own problems. Let people know that they're empowered to do these things. They don't always have to come to management every time there's an issue. If they can deal with it on their own, that's great. But you also want to let them know that there is support available to them, so they don't necessarily have to go at it alone. They're a little concerned about sitting down and talking with a coworker. That's where a manager or HR can be there, again, to kind of guide that conversation along and to help them both see that third story that we talked about a little bit earlier. Employees also need to know that if they address their problems early, there's a greater chance of success. And this is what the organization encourages them to do. So, let them know that they have some responsibilities in this, but know where to draw the line and resist that urge to get involved, because as HR people, we want to go in, we want to be helpful. It's in our collective nature to sometimes just want to do these things. And you aren't helping if you're solving the problem for somebody else. And I keep saying that, and I keep thinking, these guys and gals know this. They've all been there, and they know the dangers of trying to get too deep into somebody else's problems. Okay, solving the problem. We've established what it is, who's responsible. Now what are we going to do? So we want to get people to the point where they can create options. And when you do that, it moves them away from those positions. If they're stuck on their positions, then they see the solution from their point of view. So it's what I think, it's what the other person thinks. And it really stifles that creative energy. They're not going to be innovative around it. But if they kind of do it together, they may come to this conclusion that, hey, it's not just yours or mine. Neither of us have the best solution. The best solution is somewhere in the middle. But when you're creating those options, and you know, this is so important in negotiations or in conflict resolution. Sometimes people think, oh, gee, a good negotiation is I'll meet you halfway. I give up a little bit here, you give up a little bit there. That's not really negotiating. It's important that you realize that you're trying to come up with something that is going to be beneficial to everybody. So it's really critical that people start to look at this and say, there are some other things that are out there that don't just represent my viewpoint and don't just represent my position. And when you get them into this mode, they're really gonna, you know, they're gonna stop taking that stand and start moving away from, you know, perhaps a judgmental position that they may have been in the first place. Also, when the two parties are working to create some options, they're creating some synergy. They are identifying a lot of mutual interests and a lot of ways that this can be looked at differently. And that's what you really want. You know, you want to get that energy moving among them and have them look at this and say, hey, gee, I never thought about that. So you want to move them into some brainstorming opportunities where they're inventing possibilities, where they're listening to each other, and where they ultimately evaluate some of these options that they come up with. So some guidelines for brainstorming to keep in mind: any and all ideas are encouraged. In fact, the more ideas, the better. You want to get as many things out there on the table as possible. Everything gets written down. And this is, again, your role as a facilitator. You can be taking them on a flip chart. You can be writing them on a tablet and then sharing these with them afterwards. And, you know, speaking of technology, gee, we all have cameras on our phones now. You can just snap pictures of them and share them with the people at the end of the brainstorming session. And very, very important that during brainstorming, you don't evaluate ideas. You don't say things like, that's never going to work. That's something that we put aside for a separate session. I love this quote that I'd actually read it in a book, but I had heard the author speak at a SHRM conference many years ago, talking about inventing possibilities. It says, ask yourself, what assumptions am I making that I'm not aware I'm making, but that confirms what I see? So you're going to challenge your assumptions. When you have an answer to that, then you ask, what options are now possible that I haven't yet considered that would provide other choices? Good thing to have in your hip pocket to challenge the individuals at the start of this brainstorming session. It encourages them to come into it with an open mind. You're inventing these possibilities, but you want to separate the process of idea generation from the process of evaluating them. This is where the curiosity comes into play. Get everybody talking, get them involved, get some spontaneous ideas out there. And when you've taken the judgmental portion out of it and said, we're not going to evaluate it right now, then people will be more apt to just kind of throw anything out there without saying, yeah, if I say that, I may sound silly. I don't know that I want to do that. This is really an anything goes type of a scenario. So you want to make sure that people are likely to share whatever pops into their mind. And the more relaxed the environment is, the better opportunity you have to do that. And, you know, to the extent that you can, you want to encourage them to perhaps sit together, not necessarily across the table from each other, unless that isn't an option. But just, you know, the closer people can be in proximity, 6 feet apart these days, but it does encourage some level of camaraderie among all of the individuals. And then you want them to probe the way they were probing earlier. You want them to express some genuine interest. Keep that environment as relaxed as you can. You know, even if you're doing it on a video platform, you know, allow people to kick back if they need to get up and stretch and do things like that. That, you know, perfectly acceptable in a session like this. You just want to make sure that their comfort level is high. That's going to encourage them to just get some of those non-conventional ideas out there. You also want them to realize that they have to listen to several points of view. So it's not just about them, but you'd be surprised when people start throwing out, you know, what may seem like a wild and crazy idea. Somebody will go, gee, I never thought about that. And then what if we did this? And how about if we did something like this? You'll just see that creativity and that synergy continuing to roll. And that's really what you want to do. Now, the other thing that you can do as the facilitator is to record or get all these options written down. And that's really, really important because you want a record of everything. And, you know, again, whether you're doing it on a flip chart or on a tablet, get everything down and be prepared to send it out to people for when you enter into the next session. Because what you don't want to be doing now is worrying about evaluating. You want them thinking about as many of these options as possible. And you kind of want, you know, you want to send them away and then send the information off after they've left, so it has some time to percolate with them, so they have some time to think about it. And that's why generally it's a good idea not to go through the process of evaluating options at the same time. It can be exhausting. You know, hopefully everybody's so charged with energy that they don't have the time now to come back down and say, oh, well, now we got to evaluate this. And that's a whole different process. So schedule it at another time, give them time to think about, you know, what's been put on the table. When you come back together, you want to really highlight some of the most promising options, you know, perhaps the top 3 or 4 or 5, and then start there on how can we go about really looking at these. This is when you relax that no criticism rule. This is where judgment comes into play, because you want to determine what are some of the ideas that we can develop further. You know, what are some of those things that look a little bit promising? What can each promising idea bring to the organization? How would it be carried out? How would it be implemented? And at this point, it's good to ask things like, excuse me, or to say things like, what I like best about the idea is, or gee, number 2 looks good, but might it be better if we did something else around that? You want them to be asking what can be gained from each idea? You know, what are some of the benefits to the larger community? And as you evaluate all of these ideas, excuse me, allergies are so bad this year. You want to use objective criteria to evaluate each idea against. And that can be, you know, industry standards, things like safety standards, your own policies and procedures in your organization.
Hello, Cornelia. It's
Yes.
Magdalena. I'm sorry, I'm just doing a time check.
Mhm.
We are getting ready to go into the other session. Just wanted to check how much longer you had.
Not much longer. Actually, this is the last slide, and I'll go real quickly through this and then wrap it up. Just remember, we talked about good conflict. It can be optimized. It encourages creativity and innovation. It honors people's differences. It assures that all issues are open, they're not masked, that it's the issue that's central and not the personality, and points of view are respectfully expressed. So I invite you to stay connected. The best way to find me is on my website, bigbookofhr.com. You'll find an email address there for me, information about our other books and blogs, how to connect with me on LinkedIn, and I would love it if you did. And my final thing before I close, and this is, oh, Mondo, I did spell your name right. I want to give a shout out to a couple of folks. I know that my good friend Artie Nathan is doing a session right now about the gray areas that we deal with in HR. Well, Barbara and I wrote a book about that very topic. All of the stuff that we wrestle with as HR professionals and the conflict that comes along with it. But I wanted to mention Eileen and James and Mondo and Jan Maples and Barbara Marcus, because they all played a role in our bringing this book to market by giving us some fabulous feedback. And I just want to say thank you to the fabulous HR community in New Mexico. I'm so glad that you've allowed me to come in and to participate today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Cornelia. We really appreciate it, having you here and the subject matter. This is one of those issues that you can't work in a workplace without having some sort of conflict. And so it seems to touch everyone. I would highly encourage folks. Cornelia, could you go back one slide so that folks can go ahead and contact you directly if they have any further questions or are interested in connecting personally with Cornelia?
Yeah, probably the easiest thing is either go through the website and there's a form there that you can ask questions, or just reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. Be happy to connect with anyone.
Thank you so much. And we'll see you in the next session.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.